The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the electric company taped a shutoff notice to Marlene's front door. She stood on the porch in her nursing scrubs, still smelling of antiseptic and cafeteria coffee, holding both pieces of paper at the same time without fully processing either one. The shutoff notice was printed in red. The letter from the county probate office was printed in the kind of bureaucratic beige that made every sentence feel like it carried fine print. She read the probate letter twice before she understood what it was saying, and even then, she was not sure she believed it. Her great-uncle Darnell had died. She had not seen him in 11 years. The last time was at her mother's funeral, or where he had stood at the edge of the burial plot in a brown suit that was too big for him and shaken her hand like they were business acquaintances instead of blood. He had not called since. She had not called either. Life had a way of making distance feel polite. What Darnell had left her, according to the letter, was a parcel of land in Richfield County. 41 acres. The county assessor's recorded value was listed at the bottom of the page, and when Marlene saw the number, she actually laughed. A short, humorless sound that startled a sparrow off the porch railing. $4,200 for 41 acres. She turned the letter over to see if she had missed something on the back. She had not. Inside the house, so her daughter Simone was at the kitchen table doing homework by the light of a single lamp because Marlene had already unscrewed 2 of the bulbs to save on the electric bill. Simone was 14 and had her father's way of concentrating, forehead low, pencil moving in slow, deliberate strokes. She did not look up when Marlene came in. Marlene put both papers on the counter and started heating water on the stove, because the electric kettle had been part of the things she sold 6 months ago when the transmission on the car gave out. She stood over the pot, looked at the letters again. The shutoff notice said she had 9 days. She had $47 in her checking account and $112 in cash folded inside the lining of her winter coat, on which she kept there because she did not trust herself not to spend it if it was accessible. She was 43 years old. She had worked as a licensed practical nurse for 16 years, first at County General, then at a private care facility that had closed without warning 8 months ago, leaving her and 60 other employees with 2 weeks of severance and a laminated letter from a corporate office in another state. She had found part-time work at 2 different clinics since then, but part-time was not the same thing, and the math had not been working for a long time. She owed 4 months of back rent. She owed the electric company $231. She owed her neighbor Georgette $40 borrowed in February for Simone's school field trip, which Georgette had never once mentioned, but which Marlene thought about every time she saw her. She did not owe the grocery store anything because she had stopped buying anything that was not on sale, and some weeks that meant dinner was beans and rice and a vegetable from a can, and she told Simone it was a recipe she had been meaning to try. Simone was not fooled. Simone was 14 and sharp and saw everything, but she did not say anything about it because she was also kind in a way that sometimes broke Marlene's heart quietly and without warning. The water boiled. Marlene made tea and sat down across from her daughter and read the letter a 3rd time. 41 acres in Richfield County. She pulled up a map on her phone, which she was 3 weeks behind on the plan payment for, and searched the county. It was 3 hours southeast, down past the flat agricultural land, and into a stretch of terrain that the map showed as green and brown and largely empty. She searched the specific parcel number from the letter. The satellite view showed a dark mass of vegetation, low and dense, surrounded by scrubby tree lines. There was no road visible on the property itself. There was no structure. There was no cleared land. There was nothing but what looked, even from space, like wet ground covered in reeds and stunted growth. She searched the words. Bogland, Richfield County value. The results were not encouraging. What came up were county planning documents, agricultural extension articles about wetland remediation costs, and a regional real estate forum thread from 4 years ago in which someone had asked whether bogland in that corridor was worth purchasing, and the first response was a single word. No. She put her phone face down on the table. Simone looked up. She had her mother's eyes and her father's calm, and she looked at Marlene the way children look at a parent when they already know something is wrong and are simply waiting to be told how wrong. Marlene folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. That night, she lay in bed and thought about the money she did not have, the rent she could not pay, the 9 days on the shutoff notice, and 41 acres of land that the county had valued at just over $100 an acre, and that every available piece of evidence suggested was worthless. She thought about Darnell in his brown suit, but she thought about the fact that he had left her something, even something small, even something that made no immediate sense. She thought about what it meant that in his entire life the only thing he had accumulated worth passing on was a patch of wet ground in a county 3 hours away. She fell asleep before she reached any conclusions. In the morning, she called the county assessor's office and waited on hold for 22 minutes, which she timed on the clock above the refrigerator. The woman who finally answered was polite in a professionally distancing way and confirmed that, yes, the parcel was registered, yes, it had been transferred through probate to Marlene's name, and yes, the assessed value was correct. When Marlene asked what the land was actually good for, the woman paused for a moment and then said that it was classified as Class 4 wetland and that there were restrictions on development, and that its primary use in the assessor's records was listed as undeveloped natural land. Marlene thanked her and hung up. She called her cousin Reggie, who was the person in the family most likely to know something about property because he had once bought a foreclosed duplex and managed it for 3 years before selling it, which in family terms made him a real estate expert. Reggie answered on the second ring and listened to the whole story, and then was quiet for a moment. "Sell it," he said. "To who?" Marlene said. "It's swamp. List it. Someone will want it for hunting or something. Conservation groups sometimes buy wetlands. How long will that take?" Reggie was quiet again. Could be months. Could be longer. "You need money now?" She did not answer, which was itself an answer. Reggie said he could loan her $300, which he did not have to spare either, but offered anyway. And she said she would think about it, which meant she would not take it because she was already borrowing money she could not pay back from a neighbor who had never asked for it, and she was not willing to add Reggie to that list. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a while and did not do anything. Then she did the thing she almost never let herself do, which was to open the notebook she kept in the drawer beneath the silverware tray and write down all the numbers. Money coming in, money going out, the gap between them. She wrote it all down in her careful handwriting and looked at it. The gap was not new. The gap had been there for 8 months. What was new was that the gap had stopped being something she could manage with careful choices and had become something that was going to produce a specific outcome on a specific date. 9 days was the shutoff notice. End of the month was the rent. She did not have another month in her. She closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She called in sick to the afternoon clinic shift, which she had never done before, and she loaded Simone into the car, which made a sound it had not made before when she turned the key, and she drove 3 hours southeast toward Richfield County to look at 41 acres of land she did not understand and did not know what to do with. Simone slept for the first hour with her head against the window. Marlene drove through flat country that gradually gave way to something older and less managed. The road narrowed. Fields became tree lines became thicker growth. By the time they turned off the county highway onto the gravel road, that the GPS showed leading toward the parcel, the landscape had changed entirely. The trees on either side were dense and low, their roots visible where the shoulder of the road had eroded. The ground beside the road was dark and soft-looking. In places, standing water caught the light between the trees like small mirrors. Simone woke up when the gravel started and looked out the window. "Where are we?" she said. "End of the world," Marlene said. Simone looked at her. "I'm kidding. This is where the land is. Great-Uncle Darnell's land." Simone looked out the window again at the dense vegetation and the dark ground and the standing water between the trees. She did not say anything for a moment. "It's a swamp," she said. "Bog, technically. What's the difference?" Marlene thought about it. "I don't actually know." They parked where the gravel ended at a rusted gate that was locked with a padlock and chain, neither of which matched, which suggested they had been added at different times by different people, or possibly found. The gate itself leaned at an angle. Beyond it, a faint two-track path disappeared into the vegetation. There was a wooden post beside the gate, with a county marker nailed to it. The marker had Darnell's name on it, or had once had it. The letters faded to near illegibility. They got out of the car. The air was different here, cooler and heavier, carrying the smell of standing water and plant matter, and something older underneath that Marlene could not name. Birds moved in the brush without showing themselves. The reeds along the path's edge were tall and pale at their tips, bending slightly in a wind that was too gentle to feel on skin. Marlene found the padlock key in the envelope with the probate letter. She had not noticed it before, or had noticed it and not known what it was for. It fit the older padlock, not the newer chain, but she unwound the chain anyway and pushed the gate open, its hinge complaining with a sound like something waking up reluctantly. They walked in. The path was not dry. The ground beside it gave slightly underfoot, and in a few places the path itself had water standing in the wheel ruts. Marlene stayed to the center, and Simone walked beside her, and they did not talk for a while. The vegetation pressed in on both sides. Cattails grew in dense stands. Between them, small trees with pale bark stood with their lower trunks in water, their roots arching above the surface like the legs of something that had waded in and stayed. It went on like this for longer than Marlene expected. She had imagined something modest, a few wet acres at the edge of some other property. What she found instead was a landscape that continued past every visible horizon in every direction. The path bent, and the view changed, but the fundamental fact did not. Water, vegetation, dark earth, and silence. 41 acres of it, dense and unchanged, and entirely without apparent value. A red-winged blackbird landed on a cattail 6 feet from Marlene and looked at her with the direct, uncurious gaze of something that had never been threatened here. She stopped and looked back at it. She thought about Darnell in his brown suit. She thought about why he had kept this place. Had he tried to sell it and failed? Had he bought it young and hoped it would become something, and then grown old, waiting for something that never came? Was it sentimental? Was it an accident? The land told her nothing. The land did not seem interested in explaining itself. Simone had walked ahead a few steps and was crouching at the edge of the path, looking at something in the water. Marlene went to look. "A turtle," Simone said. "Look at the shell." It was a large painted turtle moving through shallow water with the unhurried confidence of something that had nowhere particular to be and no awareness that anywhere else existed. They watched it until it disappeared into the reeds. They did not stay much longer. There was nothing practical to do. Marlene walked the length of the path to where it ended, at a small rise in the ground, hardly more than a few feet of elevation, where the soil became slightly firmer, and she could see the bog spreading out below and around it in every direction. She stood there for a few minutes. The light was different from up here, the water visible in wider patches between the vegetation, the tree line in the distance making the scale of the place apparent. It was bigger than it had felt on the path. It was bigger than she had imagined from the map. She stood on the small rise and thought about nothing useful, and then went back to get Simone and drove home. That evening she borrowed $250 from Reggie, which she had told herself she would not do, and paid the electric company enough to keep the lights on for another cycle. She did not mention the land again. She put the probate letter in the drawer with the notebook and did not take it out for 2 weeks. What happened at the end of those 2 weeks was not dramatic. It was simply that a second letter arrived, this one from her landlord, and the number at the bottom of that letter was large enough and final enough in its language that Marlene sat with it at the kitchen table until Simone went to bed. And then she took out the probate letter and the notebook, and she spread them both on the table, and she looked at them together. The land was hers. It was documented, legally transferred, already in her name. No mortgage. No lien. She had specifically asked about liens. It belonged to her entirely. Its assessed value was $4,200, which was less than she owed her landlord, but it was an asset. It was the only unencumbered thing she owned. She began to research it differently this time, not searching for what it was worth, which she already knew was almost nothing. Instead, she researched what it was. She pulled up the county planning maps, the ones that showed zoning and classification and overlays. She found the watershed district maps. She found the environmental classification records. She found documents she did not fully understand and read them slowly anyway. The bog sat in a corridor that had been identified in a county environmental report from 6 years ago as a priority wetland area due to its intact hydrology and the presence of certain plant species associated with high-quality bog ecosystems. The report had recommended conservation measures. Nothing appeared to have come of the recommendation. She found another document, older, from a regional planning commission. It was a traffic study for a proposed expansion of Route 9, the state highway that ran through Richfield County east to west. The study included maps. She enlarged the maps on her laptop screen and moved them around with her finger until she found the relevant section. The proposed highway expansion was marked in orange. The orange line ran east through the county. She tracked it past the town center, past the grain elevator, past the junction with the county road. She tracked it further east. Her finger moved slowly across the screen. She stopped. She went back to the satellite image of the parcel. She placed it beside the planning map on the screen as best she could, comparing the shapes of tree lines and the curve of the drainage corridor. She was not an engineer. She was not a planner. She could not be certain. But the orange line on the regional planning map appeared to run directly through the area where the bog sat. Not beside it. Not near it. Through it. She sat for a long time with that information. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she made calls. She called the Regional Planning Commission and got a recorded message. She called the County Highway Department and was transferred twice and then disconnected. She called a number listed on the environmental report and reached a woman named Helen, who worked in the County Environmental Planning Office and was guardedly helpful in the way of someone whose job required neutrality on most questions. Marlene described the parcel. She asked whether the Route 9 expansion project was still active. The woman on the phone said that, as far as she knew, yes, the environmental impact studies had been completed and the project was in late planning stages. Marlene asked whether the corridor had been finalized. The woman said that corridor finalization was handled by the state DOT, not the county office, and she could not speak to specific parcel impacts. So Marlene thanked her and called the State Department of Transportation. She was on hold for 40 minutes. She timed it on the clock above the refrigerator. When someone finally answered and she explained what she was asking about, She was transferred to a project coordinator, whose name she wrote down in the margin of the notebook: James Kettrick. Kettrick was professional and careful, and said that parcel impact assessments for the Route 9 corridor were a matter of public record, and that she could access them through the DOT project portal. She found the portal. She searched the parcel number. The record took a moment to load. When it appeared on her screen, it contained a line she read 3 times to be sure she was reading it correctly. The parcel had been flagged as a potential acquisition target for right-of-way purposes under the Route 9 expansion. The flag had been placed 14 months ago. The reason for the flag was that the proposed highway alignment crossed the western third of the parcel. She did not fully understand everything on the page, but she understood enough. The state did not build highways through private land without purchasing that land first. The word for that purchase was eminent domain when it was compelled, and right-of-way acquisition when it was negotiated. Either way, the state paid. The state did not pay, based on the county assessor's value of $4,200. The state paid based on fair market value, sometimes appraised multiple times, sometimes contested, sometimes litigated, but always based on something closer to actual worth, which in the case of land the state needed to build a highway through was considerably more than the assessor's notation of undeveloped natural land. Marlene closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen table. The clock above the refrigerator ticked. Outside, a car passed on the street. Inside, Simone was still asleep because it was Saturday, and Marlene had let her sleep in. She sat there for a long time with the knowledge of what she had found and the understanding of how little she understood about what it actually meant in practical terms, in legal terms, in terms of money and timelines and processes she had never navigated. She sat with the knowledge that she had $47 in her checking account and $112 in her coat lining and 9 days, now 7 days, on the shutoff notice, which she had paid down to 2 months delinquent with Reggie's money, but not cleared entirely. She sat with the knowledge that she had a landlord's letter in the drawer that used the phrase legal proceedings in its second paragraph, and she sat with the knowledge that she owned 41 acres of land that a state highway was going to have to cross. She did not call anyone that day. She needed to think first. She had learned a long time ago, in ways that were not easy to learn, that information without understanding was not the same as power, and that acting on partial information in desperate circumstances was how people ended up worse off than they had started. She needed to understand what she actually had before she told anyone about it. She spent the weekend reading. She read about eminent domain proceedings. She read about right-of-way acquisition timelines. She read about how the state valued land for highway purposes and how property owners could contest those valuations and what the typical outcomes looked like when they did. She read a law review article written for a general audience about the difference between what the government offered and what landowners could realistically negotiate with proper legal representation. The gap between those two numbers, the article explained with carefully hedged language, was sometimes significant. She read the word significant and thought about her coat lining. She searched for lawyers who handled eminent domain cases in the state. There were more than she expected. Several had websites with phrases like maximum compensation and fight for your fair value and free initial consultation. She read the websites carefully, trying to distinguish between those that sounded credible and those that sounded like something else. She wrote down 3 names. On Monday morning, she called the first one. A secretary answered and took her information and said an attorney would call her back within 2 business days. Marlene thanked her and called the second name on her list. A man answered directly. His name was Carl Whitmore, and he said he was an associate at the firm and asked what she was calling about. She explained the situation as clearly and concisely as she could. When she finished, Whitmore was quiet for a moment. You said the parcel is flagged in the DOT portal? He said. Yes. And the corridor runs through the western third? That's what the map indicated. How large is the parcel total? 41 acres. He was quiet again. When he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that was subtle, but that Marlene, who spent her professional life reading the small shifts in people's voices and faces, noticed immediately. It had become more careful, more measured. He said he would like to schedule a consultation. He said they could do it by phone. He said there was no charge for the initial consultation. He asked when she was available. She was available now. She said Thursday, because she had a shift Wednesday that she could not miss. Thursday was fine. He would call at 10 in the morning. She thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself, very briefly, to feel something she had been careful not to feel since she found the portal record. Not hope, exactly. Something smaller than hope. A kind of careful attention to a possibility that hadn't been there before. She held it at arm's length and looked at it, and then put it away, because she had learned that carrying possibilities too closely before they had become real was a way of borrowing pain. She called the third lawyer anyway, left a message, and went to her afternoon shift at the clinic. The clinic was a narrow building in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. She worked from noon to 8. The waiting room was always full. She moved through the afternoon with the competence and economy of someone who had been doing this work long enough that the motions were automatic, which left her mind partially free to run beneath the surface of things. She thought about Darnell in his brown suit. She thought about why he had kept the land. It was possible he had known about the highway. It was possible he had been following the planning process and understood what the parcel might be worth and was waiting. But if that were true, he would have told someone. He would have done something, unless he had been waiting and had simply run out of time. Or it was possible he had not known. 41 acres of bog land in a county 3 hours from where he lived, assessed at $4,000, probably taxed at something negligible. The kind of thing you held because the holding cost almost nothing, and selling it would return almost nothing, and so there was no particular pressure to do either. The kind of thing that sat in a drawer with other papers and accumulated years without asking anything of you. And then you died, and the land passed to the nearest willing relative. And the nearest willing relative was a woman named Marlene, who stood in a strip mall clinic at 6:30 in the evening, checking a blood pressure reading and trying to understand whether her life was about to change. She thought, do not think about it until you know more. She thought, 41 acres. She took the blood pressure reading and recorded it and moved to the next room. That night, she told Simone only that she had been doing some research on the land and that there might be more to it than they had thought. Simone looked at her with those careful eyes and asked what she meant by more. Marlene said she was not sure yet, and that she would know more by the end of the week. Simone nodded and went back to her homework. Later, after Simone was in bed, Marlene took the probate letter out of the drawer and looked at it again. She looked at the parcel number and the county and the assessed value and the name Darnell Reese, listed as the previous owner. She thought about a man in a brown suit who had shaken her hand at a funeral and then disappeared back into his life and left her something she did not understand yet. She put the letter back. She looked at the shutoff notice and then folded it and put it in the same drawer. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. She lay in the dark and let herself, just for the length of a breath, consider the possibility that 41 acres of bog land in Richfield County was worth something. She let the possibility exist for exactly one breath, and then she exhaled it and closed her eyes and went to sleep, because she could not afford to carry it overnight, and she had a shift in the morning, and Simone had a math test, and the world required her to function regardless of what was or wasn't true about undeveloped wetland and state highway corridors. The next days were ordinary in their surface and strange underneath. She went to her shifts. She made meals. She helped Simone with homework. She paid the electric company the remainder of what she owed with money she had been holding for the following month's utilities, which was the kind of financial decision that felt like solving a problem and was actually only moving it. She avoided thinking about the end of the month. She avoided thinking about the landlord's letter. She bought rice and lentils and a dozen eggs and a head of cabbage and got through the week on $83. And she did not tell anyone about the phone call she had scheduled for Thursday. She did not tell Reggie. She did not tell Georgette. She especially did not tell her sister Yvette, who was the kind of person who shared news before news was ready to be shared, and who would call their cousins and their cousins' cousins with the story before Marlene had taken a second breath. She did not tell anyone because she did not know what she would be telling them, and she had lived through enough disappointments to understand that the difference between a possibility and a reality was the distance between where you were standing and where you needed to be. Thursday came. Whitmore called at 10 exactly, which she took as a good sign in a small way. She had her notes spread on the kitchen table. She had written down every number and date she knew. She had the portal record open on her laptop. He asked her to walk him through the situation from the beginning, which she did. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked several precise questions. He asked about the condition of the parcel and whether she had any documentation of its current state. She told him about the visit, the path, the water, the vegetation. He asked whether she had commissioned any survey or appraisal. She said no. He asked whether she had received any formal communication from the state DOT regarding the parcel. She said no, only the portal record. He said that the portal record was significant. He said that being flagged as a potential acquisition target meant the state had already identified the parcel as relevant to the project, which typically preceded formal contact by a period that could range from months to over a year, depending on the project timeline. He said that formal contact, when it came, would likely be in the form of an offer letter, and that the figure in the offer letter would be based on the state's own appraisal of fair market value. He said, "The state's appraisal is not the end of the negotiation." She asked him to explain. He explained. Property owners in eminent domain situations had the right to obtain their own independent appraisal, and if that appraisal differed substantially from the state's, they could negotiate, or, if necessary, litigate. He said that wetland parcels presented specific complexities because their value was not simply a matter of acreage and location. Wetlands had regulatory value, conservation value, mitigation value, and in cases where a development project required disturbing wetlands elsewhere, the right to purchase or use an existing wetland could carry significant financial worth to the project developer. She asked him what significant meant in dollar terms. He said he could not give her a number without reviewing the documentation and understanding the specific project parameters, but that parcels in similar situations, highway corridors crossing wetland areas, had resolved at figures ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars per acre, depending on classification and the project's specific mitigation requirements. She kept her voice very steady. She asked what per acre meant for 41 acres, but he said that was the kind of calculation that required precision, and that he was not in a position to give her a range without more information, but that she should understand that the county assessor's value of $4,200 for the entire parcel was, in the context of a state acquisition, essentially irrelevant. She asked what his firm's fee structure would be for representing her. He said they typically worked on a contingency basis for right-of-way matters, meaning no fee unless she received compensation, at which point they would take a percentage of the difference between the state's initial offer and the final settlement figure. She asked, "What if the state never makes a formal offer?" He said, in his experience, when a parcel is flagged in the DOT portal for a project this far into planning, the offer came. She thanked him and said she would be in touch. She hung up the phone. She sat at the kitchen table with her notes in front of her, and the laptop open and the clock ticking above the refrigerator, and the house quiet around her. She picked up her pencil and wrote at the bottom of her notes, in the careful handwriting she had been using her whole life, hundreds of thousands per acre. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she wrote, 41 acres. She did not write the product of those two figures. She was not ready to write it. She was not sure the number was real enough yet to survive being written down. She closed the laptop. She went to the window and looked out at the street. A man was walking a dog. A delivery truck was double parked 2 houses down. A child was drawing something on the sidewalk with chalk, and everything was exactly as ordinary as it had been an hour ago. She stood at the window for a while. Then she called her sister Yvette and said, "I need to talk to you about something, but I need you to promise me you won't say anything to anyone until I tell you it's okay." Yvette said, "What kind of something?" Marlene said, "The kind you're going to want to tell people." Yvette was quiet for a moment, which for Yvette was itself a kind of extraordinary response. "Okay," Yvette said. "Okay. Tell me." Marlene took a breath and told her about the land. She had been thinking about how to explain it on her way to work, on her way back, in the shower while making the lentils. She had rehearsed several versions. The version she had rehearsed was careful, hedged, qualified, full of words like might and possibly, and preliminary. What came out instead was the truth, unqualified. She told Yvette about the letter. She told her about the bog. She told her about the satellite map and the planning document, and the orange line, and the DOT portal record, and the phone call with the lawyer, and the phrase, hundreds of thousands per acre. When she was done, Yvette was quiet for so long that Marlene checked to see if the call had dropped. Yvette said, "They gave her worthless bog land." "Yes," Marlene said, "and the highways going through it. That's what the records show." Yvette said, "Marlene, I know." "No, Marlene. Marlene, I know. How much is 41 acres at hundreds of thousands per acre?" Marlene said she had not let herself calculate it yet. Yvette calculated it out loud, badly, and then calculated it again, and then was quiet. After a moment she said, "Darnell knew." Marlene said she did not know if Darnell had known. He had to have known. Nobody just holds swampland for 40 years. Marlene said, "Maybe." There was a pause. Yvette said, "Do you understand what this means?" Marlene said, "I'm trying to." She stood at the window with the phone and watched the child drawing on the sidewalk. The drawing was large and ambitious, and she was too far away to see what it was. She thought about 9 days on a shutoff notice. She thought about her coat lining. She thought about beans and rice and a can of vegetables, and telling Simone it was a recipe she had been meaning to try. She thought about a man in a brown suit who had shaken her hand at a funeral and then gone back to his life and held on to 41 acres of wet ground for reasons she would never know. She thought, "Do not spend the money before it exists." And she thought, "But it might exist." She thought, "It might." The problem with telling Yvette was that Yvette told people. Marlene had known this going in. She had extracted the promise, had heard Yvette say, "Okay, okay," in that serious voice, and had believed it for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, her cousin Reggie called and said he had heard something interesting from Yvette and wanted to know if it was true that Marlene had inherited swampland that a highway was going through. Marlene said she was still looking into it. Reggie said that sounded like a yes. She said it sounded like nothing yet and asked him to please not talk about it further. He said, of course, absolutely, no problem, and she knew from the speed of his agreement that he had already told at least one other person. By the end of the second week, the story had traveled through her family the way water travels through porous ground. It did not announce itself loudly. It seeped. It appeared in the corners of conversations she wasn't part of, and then surfaced in calls she received from people she had not spoken to in months. Her Aunt Celestine called to ask how she was doing, which was something Celestine did not do without cause. Her cousin Derek, who lived in another state and communicated primarily through forwarded videos and holiday texts, called to say he had heard the news and that it sounded promising. He used the word promising with the careful optimism of someone who did not want to sound too hopeful, but could not entirely hide that he was. Marlene told everyone the same thing. She was still looking into it. Nothing was confirmed. Please do not say anything to anyone. Well, this instruction had the effect of making people say things to everyone immediately, but with the framing that Marlene had asked them not to share it, which was somehow more interesting than the story itself. What she had not anticipated, and perhaps should have, was the other direction the story would travel. Not just outward through the family, but downward into the specific community of people who knew her circumstances. Her neighbor Georgette, who still had not mentioned the $40, heard something from someone and appeared at Marlene's door on a Saturday morning with a casserole and a look that contained equal parts goodwill and evaluation. They sat at the kitchen table, and Georgette said she had heard something about land and a highway, and asked if Marlene was okay. Marlene said she was fine, that things were still very uncertain, that she did not want anyone to get the wrong idea. Georgette nodded and said, of course, and left the casserole, which was genuinely good, and which Marlene and Simone ate over 3 days. The thing about having very little money was that the people around you tracked the edges of your circumstances more closely than you might expect. Not maliciously, mostly. It was just that, when someone was visibly struggling, their situation became a kind of ongoing story that others followed, the way people followed a difficult weather system, checking it periodically to see what had developed. Marlene had been that story for 8 months. Now the story had a new element, and the new element was the kind that changed how people read everything that came before it. Some people were genuinely happy for her. She could see it clearly, the uncomplicated pleasure of people who liked her and wanted things to go well for her. Georgette was one of those. Reggie, underneath the nosiness, was another. Her friend Patricia from the old hospital job called and said she had heard something, and she just wanted to say she was rooting for her, and her voice was warm in a way that had nothing complicated in it. Others were something else. She noticed it first in small ways. A woman from her building who had always been pleasant began to look at her with a particular kind of attention when they passed in the hallway, a measuring look that Marlene recognized without being able to name immediately. A man she knew from the clinic waiting room, old, whose daughter was a patient and who she had always exchanged a few words with, asked her one afternoon if it was true she had come into some land. When she said she was looking into a situation with some inherited property, his expression shifted in a way that was subtle but clear. He nodded and said, "Well, good for you," and the words were fine, but the tone carried something underneath that was less fine. She understood it. She did not enjoy it, but she understood it. When someone had very little and then appeared to be getting more, the people around them sometimes responded with a generosity that was genuine, and sometimes with something that looked like generosity and was actually a kind of resentment at the change, at the disruption to the story they had been following. Oh, at the way the world had rearranged itself without asking them first. What she did not expect was her brother-in-law Marcus. Marcus was Yvette's husband, and had never liked Marlene with any particular intensity in either direction. He was the kind of man who had opinions about everything, and expressed them confidently, and was sometimes right, which was enough to sustain a belief in his own judgment, that occasionally outpaced the evidence. He had been in real estate-adjacent work for several years, managing properties for a company that did commercial leasing, and this gave him, in his own assessment, a comprehensive understanding of how land and money worked. He called her on a Wednesday evening. She was tired from a double shift and had just sat down with a cup of tea when her phone rang with his name on the screen, and he said he had been thinking about her situation. She said she appreciated it. He said he wanted to give her some advice, which was that she should be careful. He said these DOT situations were complicated and that the state was not going to give her what she thought she was going to get. He said the assessed value was the assessed value for a reason, and that whatever a lawyer had told her about potential compensation, lawyers said things like that to get clients. He said he had seen situations like this, and they rarely turned out the way people expected. She asked him what situations like this he had seen. He said he had seen plenty in his line of work. She asked him specifically what he knew about wetland right-of-way acquisition for state highway projects. He paused. He said he was speaking generally, from experience. She said she appreciated his concern, and that she was working with a lawyer who specialized in exactly this type of matter. Marcus said, "Marlene, that land is a swamp. You know that, right? Whatever anyone is telling you, that land is a swamp. And the county had it valued at nothing because that's what it's worth." She said, "I know what the county had it valued at, Marcus." He said, "I just don't want you getting your hopes up and then being in a worse position than you're already in." She said, "I appreciate that." He said, "Yvette thinks this is going to change everything, and I just think someone needs to be realistic with you." She said, "I appreciate your concern. Thank you for calling." She hung up and drank her tea and did not think about Marcus for the rest of the evening because he was not worth the energy, and the tea was still warm, and she had a shift in the morning. But she thought about what he had said in the days that followed, not because she believed it, but because she understood where it came from, and because that understanding was useful. People who doubted her tended to do so from a specific place. They could see her circumstances clearly and could not see past them. When you had watched someone struggle for long enough, it became difficult to imagine them not struggling. The struggling became the story, and the story resisted revision. She had watched that happen with other people. She had watched it happen with her mother, who had worked 2 jobs for 20 years and never stopped being referred to by certain relatives as the one who never caught a break, even after she bought her house, even after she put both her children through school. The story had been said early, and it adhered. Marlene did not intend to let that happen here. She did not intend to perform confidence she did not have, but she also did not intend to apologize for what she was beginning to understand might be real. What made it difficult was that she still did not know. That was the central fact of those weeks. She did not know. She had a portal record and a lawyer's careful language and a planning map with an orange line. And she had done enough reading to understand that these things meant something. But she had not received a formal offer from the state, had not had an appraisal, had not been contacted by anyone official. She was working with an outline and no numbers. Carl Whitmore called every 2 weeks with updates that were mostly non-updates. He was reviewing the project documentation. He had requested the environmental impact assessment from the DOT. He was building a picture of the project's specific requirements for the corridor in question. He said these things were necessary, and she believed him and thanked him and hung up and went back to her shifts and her budget and the clock above the refrigerator. Simone knew more than Marlene had told her, which was typical of Simone. She had apparently had a conversation with Yvette's youngest, who was her age, and went to the same school, and had returned from that conversation with a specific kind of knowing quietness that Marlene recognized as her daughter, processing information and deciding how to respond to it. She did not bring it up for several days, and when she did, it was oblique. She said, at dinner, Cousin Jade said something about the land. Marlene said, "What did she say?" "She said you might get a lot of money from the government for it." Marlene said, "It's possible that the state might need to purchase part of it for a highway they're building. We don't know yet how much they'd pay, or when." Simone said, "But it could be a lot." Marlene said, "I don't know what a lot means yet." Simone nodded and ate her rice and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are we going to be okay in the meantime?" Marlene looked at her daughter. Simone was looking at her plate. No, but her shoulders were tight in the way they got when she was trying to appear less concerned than she was. Marlene said, "Yes." Simone nodded. They are the rest of dinner talking about Simone's biology project, which was about soil composition, which Marlene found quietly remarkable given the circumstances, and she did not mention that. The formal letter from the State Department of Transportation arrived on a morning in early spring, 6 weeks after Marlene had spoken with Whitmore for the first time. It was a thick envelope, cream-colored, with the state seal in the upper left corner and a return address that identified the sender as the Office of Right-of-Way Acquisition. Marlene found it in the mailbox on her way out the door to her morning shift. She stood on the front step and looked at it for a moment, and then put it in her bag and drove to the clinic. She did not open it during her shift. She thought about it continuously during her shift, but she did not open it because she had decided that she needed to be in a state of mind that permitted clear reading. And a full shift at the clinic left her in a state of mind that was competent but not clear in that particular way. She opened it at 4:15, sitting in her car in the clinic parking lot with the engine off and the afternoon sun low through the windshield. The letter was formal and dense, with language that was precisely constructed to be polite without being warm. It explained that pursuant to the Route 9 corridor expansion project, and the department had identified her parcel as lying within the proposed right-of-way corridor, and that the department wished to open discussion regarding the voluntary acquisition of the relevant portion of the parcel. It said that the department had commissioned an appraisal of the affected area, and that the enclosed appraisal summary reflected the department's determination of fair market value for the acquisition. She turned to the appraisal summary. The department's appraiser had assessed the parcel at $11,800 for the full 41 acres, with a proposed acquisition price for the western 22 acres at $6,400. She read that number twice, $6,400. She sat in the parking lot with the letter in her hands and looked at the number. The afternoon light moved through the windshield, and the parking lot was mostly empty, and somewhere nearby, a truck was backing up, and its beeper was counting out a slow rhythm. $6,400 for 22 acres of land that a state highway was going to be built through. She thought about what Whitmore had said. The state's appraisal is not the end of the negotiation. She put the letter back in the envelope, carefully, and drove home. She called Whitmore from the kitchen table while Simone was in the shower. She read him the figures. There was a pause on his end that she recognized now as the pause of someone who was not surprised but was choosing how to respond. He said, "That's consistent with what I expected from them on initial offer." She said, $6,400. He said, "Yes, for a parcel. That, based on what I've been reviewing, has substantially greater value than they are representing. I want to be clear about what's happening here. Their appraisal assessed this as undeveloped wetland, with no particular features, meriting above minimum valuation. They have not accounted for the mitigation value." She asked him to explain mitigation value again because she had read about it, but wanted to hear him say it. He said, "When a state highway project disturbs or destroys wetlands, federal and state environmental law requires the project to compensate for that destruction by protecting restoring, or creating wetland area elsewhere. That compensation is called mitigation. In some cases, projects can use existing high-quality wetland parcels as mitigation credit rather than creating new ones. The value of mitigation credit is separate from, and in addition to the value of the land itself as raw acreage. If this parcel qualifies, and based on the environmental classification records I've reviewed, I believe it very likely does, the mitigation value could substantially exceed the land's market value. She said, "By how much?" He said, "I don't want to give you a figure until we have our own appraisal. But I can tell you that wetland mitigation credits in this region have sold for between $50,000 and $80,000 per acre in recent years, depending on classification and project need." She kept her voice very level. She said, "Per acre." He said, "Per acre." She said, "And they're acquiring 22 acres. He said, "That's what the letter indicates." She was quiet. He said, "I want to be clear that this is a process. Our appraisal will need to be commissioned and completed, which will take several weeks. We will then present it to the DOT and enter negotiation. They may accept our figure, or they may make a counteroffer, or if we cannot reach agreement, the matter may go to a hearing. These things take time, sometimes months." She said, "I understand." He said, "But I want you to know that based on what I've reviewed, I believe their offer is not an accurate reflection of this land's value to the project." She said, "Thank you." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment. The shower had stopped running. She could hear Simone moving around in her room. She took out the notebook from the drawer beneath the silverware tray. She opened it to the page where she had written hundreds of thousands per acre. Below that, she wrote the new figure Whitmore had given her, 50 to 80,000 per acre. Below that, she wrote 22 acres. She did not do the multiplication. Not yet. The weeks that followed were a lesson in a particular kind of patience that Marlene had not previously needed to practice. It was not the patience of waiting for something to get better on its own, which she had been doing for 8 months, and which she knew well. It was the patience of waiting for something real, something already in motion, something that required time, not because time was stalling it, but because time was part of how it worked. The independent appraiser was a woman named Dr. Sonia Okafor, who held certifications in environmental valuation and wetland assessment, and who Whitmore had worked with before and trusted. She scheduled a site visit 2 weeks after Marlene engaged the firm formally, which required signing paperwork that committed her to the contingency arrangement, and also to a commitment that felt different from anything she had signed before. Not a commitment of money she did not have, but a commitment of her own claim, her own standing, her own insistence that the land was worth more than the state was saying. Marlene drove to the parcel on the day of the site visit. She had arranged to meet Dr. Okafor at the gate. She arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the car at the end of the gravel road, listening to the birds. Dr. Okafor arrived exactly on time. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with close-cropped hair and the kind of practical outdoor clothing that was selected for function rather than appearance. She shook Marlene's hand with a firm directness and said she had reviewed the environmental records and found the parcel interesting. She said interesting in the way someone who spent their days assessing land said interesting, which meant something specific and positive. They walked the property together for 3 hours. Marlene had brought the old probate documents and the county marker records. Dr. Okafor brought her own equipment, a kit of sampling tools, and a GPS device, and a water testing kit, and a notebook that she wrote in constantly. She took samples from 3 locations, measured water depth in 4 places, photographed the plant communities extensively, and spent 20 minutes at the small rise near the center of the parcel, crouching and standing and looking in different directions with an expression of focused concentration. She asked Marlene questions as they walked. How long had the parcel been held without development? Whether there had been any attempts at drainage, whether she knew of any herbicide or pesticide use, whether the neighboring parcels were in similar condition. Marlene answered what she could and said she did not know to the rest. At the end of the 3 hours, standing beside the cars at the gate, Dr. Okafor said she would need 2 weeks to complete the assessment and write the report. But she could tell Marlene that the parcel presented characteristics consistent with a high-quality interior bog ecosystem, including specific plant indicator species that were uncommon in the region and that carried weight in classification decisions. She said the hydrology appeared intact, meaning the water movement through the system had not been interrupted by drainage or diversion. She said the absence of development pressure on the parcel over a long period had allowed the system to persist in a condition that was increasingly rare in the region. She said, "This is not common ground." Marlene said, "I know, it's a bog." Dr. Okafor looked at her and then smiled briefly. She said, "What I mean is that it is ecologically significant. That significance has monetary implications in the context of your situation. I will explain all of that in the report." She got in her car and drove away. Marlene stood at the gate for a moment. The bog was quiet behind her. The gate leaned at its angle. The county marker with Darnell's faded name caught the afternoon light. She thought, ecologically significant. She thought, what a thing to have been holding all along without knowing it. She locked the gate and got in her car. The 2 weeks while Dr. Okafor completed the report were when the story in Marlene's community reached its widest circulation. She did not spread it further herself, but she had not found a way to stop it from spreading, and by that point, she was not sure stopping it was possible, or perhaps even the right thing to try. What she noticed was that the story had changed in the telling. By the time it came back to her from people who had heard it through 4 removes, it had grown. The 22 acres had become the whole 41. The uncertain per-acre figure had become a specific and very large total. The careful conditional language had been shed entirely. What remained was a story in which Marlene was going to be rich. She heard this story from a woman at the laundromat who had heard it from someone who worked at the same building as Yvette. She heard a version of it from a man at the grocery store who knew Reggie and thought he was paying her a compliment when he said, "Well, I heard about your luck. Good for you." She heard a version from a former colleague who called to congratulate her, and in the same breath mentioned that she was in a difficult financial situation herself and wondering if Marlene might be able to help out. She was not unkind to any of them. She said the situation was still unresolved, that nothing was finalized, that she appreciated everyone's goodwill. She said these things patiently and without edge, because the people saying them were mostly not malicious, and they were just people with their own needs and their own readiness to believe in transformations, because transformations were something everyone wanted to believe were possible. But Marcus called again. He called on a Sunday evening, and this time, his voice had a different quality than the first call. The first call had been the voice of someone offering unsolicited caution. This call was the voice of someone who had been thinking about something and had decided to say it directly. He said he had heard the numbers people were throwing around. She said, "People are speculating." He said, "Marlene, I want to be honest with you. The numbers I'm hearing are not realistic. You need to understand that wetland mitigation is a complicated market and that lawyers tell you what you want to hear to get you to hire them. And at the end of this, you're going to get something closer to what the state offered you, which is not nothing, but is not what people are saying it is." She said, "I appreciate you sharing your perspective." He said, "I've been in property for a long time." She said, "I know you have, Marcus." He said, I just don't want Yvette to get her hopes up and then be disappointed, she said. I think Yvette is a grown woman who can manage her own expectations, he said. You know what I mean, she said. I do know what you mean. I think what you mean is that you don't think I'm going to get what I think I'm going to get. And I think you might be right. And I think if you're right, I'll handle it. And I think if you're wrong, we'll have an interesting conversation at some point. Either way, I appreciate the call. She hung up. She was shaking slightly, which was not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. She sat at the table and breathed and let the shaking resolve, and then she made tea and looked at the notebook and thought about what she knew and what she did not know and what knowing things had required of her in her life. It had required work. That was the thing. It had required reading documents she did not fully understand, and calling offices, and being transferred, and holding for 22 minutes, and 40 minutes, and driving 3 hours to look at a bog, and standing on a small rise of ground, and looking at 41 acres of water and vegetation, and thinking, what is this? What is this actually? It had not required luck. Or it had required luck, in the sense that Darnell had kept the land and left it to her rather than selling it for $4,000 when he needed money. And that was a kind of luck, but luck was only the beginning. Everything after that had been work, and she had done the work not because she knew it would lead somewhere, but because she could not afford not to know whether it would. She drank the tea and thought about Marcus, and then stopped thinking about Marcus and looked at the notebook instead. Dr. Okafor's report arrived by email on a Wednesday, forwarded by Whitmore, with a note that said he had reviewed it and would call her that afternoon. The report was 43 pages, and she read all of it, slowly, over 2 hours before Whitmore called. When she read the technical sections she did not fully understand, and the sections she did understand, and the summary, which she read 3 times. When Whitmore called, he was not careful in the way he had been careful in previous calls. He was direct. He said, "The report supports a significantly higher valuation than the state's initial appraisal. Dr. Okafor has classified the parcel as a Category 2 high-quality interior bog with intact hydrology and a documented presence of 2 plant species that carry elevated ecological significance in the regional mitigation market. Her assessment of mitigation credit value for the 22 acres under acquisition is between $62,000 and $78,000 per acre, in addition to market value for the land itself, which she places at $1,200 per acre based on comparable wetland sales in the region." Marlene had her pencil in her hand. She wrote the numbers on the edge of the notebook page. Whitmore said, "The total compensation range Dr. Okafor supports, including land value and mitigation credit value, for the 22 acres under acquisition, is between $1.4 million and $1.78 million. She did not write those numbers. Her hand had stopped. She said, "Can you say that again?" He said it again, slowly. $1.4 million to $1.78 million. She said, "For 22 acres. He said, "For 22 acres of the parcel. The remaining 19 acres are not under acquisition and remain yours." She said nothing for a moment. And he said, "I want to be clear that this is the range our appraiser supports. The state will not accept this figure immediately. We will present it. They will respond with a counter, likely substantially lower, and we will negotiate from there. The process will take time. It is possible the matter will go to a formal hearing if we cannot reach agreement. But I want you to understand what the professional assessment of this land's value to the project is." She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you have questions?" She said, "I have many questions. I just need a moment." He said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." She put the phone down on the table without hanging up and looked at the number she had written. 62 to 78,000 per acre. 22 acres. 1.4 million to 1.78 million. The clock above the refrigerator ticked. Outside, the street sounded the way it always sounded. A car, a voice somewhere. The ordinary texture of an ordinary day in an ordinary neighborhood. She picked the phone back up. She said, "What is the next step?" He said, "We send our appraisal to the DOT formally and request a meeting. Standard procedure. They have 30 days to respond to the counter." She said, "And then," he said, "and then we negotiate." She said, "Okay." He said, "I want to say one more thing. In my experience with cases of this type, when the mitigation value is this clearly documented by a qualified assessor, the state's position changes significantly at the negotiating table. They have a project timeline. The highway has to be built. Delays cost them money. And if they cannot reach agreement with you, they can condemn the property through eminent domain, but that triggers a court proceeding, and their own timeline becomes uncertain. They prefer to negotiate." She said, "They prefer to negotiate." He said, "In my experience, yes." She said, "All right. Send the appraisal." She hung up the phone. She sat in the kitchen in the quiet afternoon. The tea she had made was cold. Simone was at school. The apartment was as still as she had ever heard it. She thought about the shutoff notice. She thought about the coat lining with the $112 in it. She thought about the lentils and the eggs and the cabbage and the grocery store math she had been doing for 8 months. She thought, "None of that is the number that was just said to me." She thought, "Those two things are from the same life, but they are not from the same world." She opened the notebook. On the page with all the careful numbers, below the figure Whitmore had just given her, she wrote 2 words. She wrote them not because she was certain, because she wasn't certain. The negotiation had not happened. The settlement had not been reached. The check did not exist. None of it was real yet in the way money had to be real before you could use it. She wrote them because they were true in the way that a possibility clearly in motion is true, which is a different kind of truth than the finished fact, but a truth nonetheless. She wrote, "It's real." She closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. That evening she picked up Simone from school. They drove home the way they always drove, past the grocery store and the nail salon and the strip mall clinic where Marlene worked afternoons. Simone was talking about something that had happened at school, a disagreement between 2 friends of hers, and Marlene listened and offered appropriate responses and drove. At a red light, Simone stopped mid-sentence and looked at her. She said, "Something happened." Marlene said, "What do you mean?" Simone said, "You look different, like when you're trying not to look different." Marlene glanced at her. The light changed. She drove. She said, "The lawyer called today, with the appraiser's report." Simone said, "And?" Marlene said, "It was a good report." Simone said, "How good?" Marlene said, "Very good. We still have to go through a negotiation process with the state. Nothing is done yet. But the appraiser's assessment of what the land might be worth was much higher than I was expecting." Simone said, "How much higher?" Marlene said, "A lot." Simone looked at her for a moment. She was quiet in a way that was not a 14-year-old's quiet, but something older, something she had developed over 8 months of watching her mother manage the edges of a situation that neither of them had chosen. She said, "Are we going to be okay?" Marlene said, "I believe so. I really believe so." Simone turned back to the window and looked at the street passing by. Marlene could see the side of her face, the set of her jaw, the slight release of something that had been held in it. After a moment, Simone said, "Good." She did not say anything more about it for the rest of the drive. She went back to talking about her friends and the disagreement. And Marlene listened, and they drove home, and the city moved around them the way cities do, indifferent and continuous and full of people who did not know that a woman driving a car with a transmission that made a sound had just been told that the swamp her great-uncle left her was worth more than she had earned in the past 8 years, combined. The negotiation began 31 days after Whitmore submitted the counter-appraisal to the DOT. The response came in the form of a meeting request, which Marlene attended by phone, sitting at her kitchen table at 8 in the morning with the notebook open and a cup of tea going cold beside her. There were 3 people on the DOT's side: a project coordinator named Webb, an attorney from the state counsel's office, whose name Marlene did not catch clearly, and someone from the right-of-way acquisition office. They were professional and neutral, in a way that public officials were professional and neutral, which was to say they were pleasant and gave away nothing. Webb said the department had reviewed Dr. Okafor's report. He said the department's own appraisers had concerns about the mitigation valuation methodology and the classification level assigned to the parcel. He said the department was prepared to offer a revised acquisition price, reflecting additional consideration for the parcel's environmental characteristics. He named a figure of $42,000. Whitmore, who was also on the call, said, "The department's revised offer does not reflect the documented mitigation credit value of the parcel as assessed by Dr. Okafor, who is a recognized authority in wetland valuation in this region. We believe the appropriate range is significantly higher, and we would like to discuss the specific basis for the department's concern with Dr. Okafor's methodology." What followed was 2 hours of technical exchange that Marlene followed as carefully as she could and understood approximately 60% of. What she understood was that the DOT's appraisers had used a different classification system for the bog's plant communities, one that assigned them a lower tier, and that Dr. Okafor had used a more recent and more specific methodology that the DOT had not yet formally adopted into its standard practice. Whitmore said, "The methodology Dr. Okafor used is consistent with current federal guidance and has been accepted in 4 recent proceedings in adjacent states. If the department would like to discuss the classification basis in detail, we can arrange a technical review session with Dr. Okafor directly." There was a pause on the DOT's side. Webb said, "We would be open to that." The meeting ended without a number. Whitmore told Marlene afterward that this was normal and that the offer of a technical review session was a positive sign. He said, "They know the report is solid. What they're doing now is looking for a reason to move towards settlement rather than litigation, because litigation is expensive and uncertain for them. The technical session is them looking for a face-saving path to a higher number." Marlene said, "How long will the technical session take to arrange?" He said, 2 to 3 weeks. She said, "And after that?" He said, "Another exchange, another offer. We're probably looking at 2 to 3 rounds of negotiation before we reach a figure we can discuss seriously." She said, "What does discuss seriously mean?" He said, "It means a figure both parties can justify. Based on the report and the project parameters, I would expect that figure to be substantially above the DOT's current offer." She said, "Substantially above 42,000. He said, "Yes." She said, "How substantially?" He said, "I don't want to put a number on it yet, but I think when we're done, you'll find this has been worth pursuing." She thanked him and hung up and looked at the notebook and the numbers and thought about the gap between $42,000 and $1.4 million and what it meant to be somewhere in between those 2 figures without knowing where you would land. She thought, "This is not over. This is still happening." She thought, "That is a different thing than it being lost." She went to her afternoon shift at the clinic. She checked blood pressures and changed dressings and listened to people describe their symptoms and their lives and she did it all with the same competence and care she always brought to it. And underneath all of that, in the quiet running current of her mind, she held the knowledge of what was still in motion. 300 miles southeast, in Richfield County, the bog sat as it always sat. Water moved through it in the slow way that water moved through intact hydrology. The plant communities Dr. Okafor had photographed and sampled continued their ordinary biological work. The red-winged blackbirds landed on the cattails. The painted turtle moved through the shallows. It did not know it was worth anything. It did not know anything was at stake. It simply was what it had always been, which was a living system that had persisted in a landscape where living systems were increasingly rare, and which had been left to Marlene by a man in a brown suit who had kept it for 40 years, without, perhaps, ever fully knowing what he was keeping. And now Marlene was keeping it too, while the process moved at its own pace, and the numbers negotiated themselves towards something that was not yet real and not yet hers, but which was, unmistakably, approaching. The technical review session happened on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week of April, conducted by video call with Dr. Okafor, presenting her methodology to the DOT's team of 3, which had grown to 5 for this occasion, and adding 2 environmental scientists whose names appeared in the project's internal documentation and whose presence suggested the department was taking the classification dispute seriously. Marlene was not on that call. Whitmore had advised her to stay off it, not because her presence would hurt anything, but because technical sessions were most effective when they operated as professional conversations between experts, without the emotional stakes of the primary parties creating pressure in the room. He had said, "Let the science speak first." She went to her morning clinic shift instead, and tried to let the science speak. Whitmore called her at 2 in the afternoon. She was in the break room eating half a sandwich she had brought from home. He said, "I think we're going to be okay." She put the sandwich down. And he said, "The DOT's scientists pushed back on 2 of Dr. Okafor's classification points, which was expected." She held on both. "The stronger point is the hydrology. The intact drainage pattern and the absence of historical disturbance are difficult to dispute with an alternative methodology because they're physical facts on the ground, not interpretive judgments. The DOT's team acknowledged the hydrology findings. That matters because intact hydrology is one of the primary criteria for premium mitigation credit pricing in this region." She said, "What does that mean for the number?" He said, "I think we're going to see a substantially revised offer in the next 2 weeks. I won't put a figure on it yet, but the direction is clear." She said, "Thank you." She finished the sandwich and went back to work. The revised offer came in 11 days. It was not a phone call this time. It was a formal letter, cream envelope, state seal, same format as the first one. Marlene found it in the mailbox on a Thursday evening, and this time she did not put it in her bag. She sat in the car in front of her building and opened it in the late afternoon light. The Department of Transportation, pursuant to further review of the environmental assessment submitted by the landowner's representative, and in consideration of the parcel's documented ecological characteristics, was revising its acquisition offer. The revised offer for the right-of-way acquisition of the western 22 acres of the parcel, inclusive of mitigation credit consideration, was $340,000. She read it again. $340,000. She sat in the car for a long time. The light changed around her. People walked past on the sidewalk. A child on a bicycle rode by twice. She sat with the letter in her hands and felt something moving through her that was not quite any single emotion, but was composed of several, layered and simultaneous, the way music had layers you could hear separately if you listened for them. $340,000 was not $1.4 million. It was not the top of Dr. Okafor's range, or the middle, or even the lower end. It was a negotiating figure. She understood that. Whitmore had prepared her for the shape of this process, but it was also, undeniably, real. It was a number with 6 digits, written on state letterhead by people who had reviewed the science and adjusted their position, which meant the science had moved them, which meant the science was right, which meant the land was worth what Dr. Okafor said it was worth, and the DOT knew it and was now deciding how much of that knowledge to honor. She called Whitmore from the car. He had already received the letter electronically. He said, "This is a significant movement from their initial position. They came up from 42,000 to 340,000. That tells you what they know about this property's value to the project." She said, "Is it enough?" He said, "It's a starting point for serious negotiation. My recommendation is that we counter at 1.2 million and be prepared to settle somewhere between 600,000 and 900,000, depending on how far they're willing to move." She repeated those numbers quietly. He said, "The 340 tells us they have room. If they were at their ceiling, they would have come up less dramatically, or they would have signaled that this was close to final. A jump from 42 to 340 is not the behavior of a party at its ceiling." She said, "Okay," he said. "I know this is a lot to hold at once." She said, "I'm managing," he said. "I know you are." She thanked him and hung up and drove home. That night, after Simone was in bed, Marlene took the notebook out of the drawer and opened it to the page with all the numbers. She added 340,000 to the column. She looked at the column. She looked at the gap between 340 and 1.2 million, and thought about what it meant to negotiate in that gap, which was that somewhere in that gap was a number that would change everything. She did not write a number, or she had stopped writing numbers she did not have yet, but she sat with the range and let it be real in the way things that were not yet real could be held, carefully at arm's length, like something that needed to be kept warm without being squeezed. In the morning, she called Yvette. She said, "I have an update." Yvette said, "Tell me." She told her about the revised offer, $340,000. Yvette was quiet for a moment, and then said something in a voice that was not quite a word, just a sound, that contained the compressed response of someone who had been waiting and was now absorbing the first concrete confirmation that the waiting had been about something real. Marlene said, "We haven't settled yet. Whitmore's going to counter at a much higher number. We don't know where we'll land." Yvette said, "But 340 is on the table." Marlene said, "340 is on the table." Yvette said, Marlene said, "I know." There was a pause. Yvette said, "I need to call Marcus." Marlene said, "You don't have to do that." Yvette said, "I want to." Marlene said, "Yvette." Yvette said, "He told you it was a swamp." Marlene said, "It is a swamp. That's why it's worth what it's worth." Yvette laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that came when something was funny in a way that was also true. She said, "I'll be subtle." Marlene said, "Please don't be subtle." She hung up and was smiling, which was something she had not expected to feel, and she let it stay for a moment before she went to make Simone's breakfast. The counteroffer went out from Whitmore's office on a Monday morning, $1.2 million. Marlene had signed the authorization on Friday, sitting across from Whitmore in his office, which was modest and organized and smelled of coffee and old files, and which felt, in its ordinariness, like exactly the right place to sign a document that said she was asking the state of this country for $1.2 million for a bog that the county had valued at $4,200. She had asked him, before she signed, whether he thought they would get there. He had said, "I think we'll get close. I don't know if we'll get there exactly, but I think the final number will be something you'll be satisfied with." She had asked, "What does satisfied mean to you?" He had looked at her carefully, the way people looked when they were about to say something they wanted to say accurately. He said, "In my experience, unsatisfied means being able to do the things you needed to do and not needing to look at numbers on a page the same way you've been looking at them." She had signed the document. The 30 days that followed were the strangest she could remember in a life that had contained a reasonable number of strange periods. Nothing outwardly changed. She still went to her shifts. She still made meals. Simone still went to school and came home and did homework and had the ordinary crises and achievements of being 14. The clock still ticked above the refrigerator. The car still made its sound. But underneath all of that, the negotiation was happening. She knew it was happening because Whitmore called with updates every few days. The DOT had responded to the 1.2 counter with a request for additional documentation of comparable mitigation credit sales in the region, which Dr. Okafor provided within a week. The DOT had then requested a 30-day extension to the negotiation timeline, which Whitmore had agreed to with a counter-condition that the extension not delay the project's own acquisition deadline, which was a way of saying, you need this parcel, and you know you need it, and extending the clock does not change that. The extension was agreed. The negotiation continued. During those 30 days, the story in Marlene's community continued its complicated life. The revised offer figure had made its way into circulation, which meant the conversations around her had shifted again. The people who had been skeptical now had a harder surface to push against. $340,000 was not the kind of number that sustained easy doubt. Marcus had gone quiet on the subject in a way that was itself a kind of response. He had not called again. Yvette had reported, with visible satisfaction, that he had been unusually reserved on the matter at a family dinner, offering no opinions where previously he had offered many. Others, including people Marlene did not know well, had begun to treat her differently in small ways she noticed without drawing attention to. The woman in her building, who had looked at her with that measuring gaze, now offered brief, warm smiles when they passed. The man from the clinic waiting room had stopped asking questions and started making statements and saying things like, "You deserve it," and "I always knew you were smart about things." Statements that had not been his position when this began, but which he was now revising into without apparent awareness of the revision. She did not hold it against any of them. That was not where she chose to put her energy. What she put her energy into was the negotiation, and into her work, and into Simone. Simone had her own relationship to the situation that Marlene watched, with the particular attention a parent paid to a child who was old enough to understand something, and young enough that understanding it might cost them something. She watched Simone navigate the weeks with a composure that was sometimes heartbreaking in its effort, and sometimes simply admirable. At school, apparently, there was significant awareness of the story, and Simone had mentioned once that people were asking her about it, and that she had told them she didn't really know the details, which was not entirely true, but was the right answer. Marlene had asked her, "Does it bother you, people knowing our business?" Simone had said, "It bothered me more when our business was the other kind." Marlene had not had an answer to that, because it was simply true, and there was nothing useful to add to it. What she did tell Simone during this period were the things she thought a 14-year-old should understand about what was happening. Not the numbers, not yet, not until the numbers were real, but the shape of it. She told her about Dr. Okafor and what she had found in the bog. She told her about intact hydrology and mitigation credits and how the value of a thing and the price attached to it were not always the same. She told her that the reason the state had undervalued the land initially was not dishonesty, but assumption. They had assumed that bog land was worth next to nothing because most people assumed that, and the assumption had been allowed to stand until someone with the right knowledge looked carefully enough to challenge it. Simone had listened to all of this and then said, "So they didn't know what it was?" Marlene said, "They knew it was a bog. They didn't know what made this particular bog matter." Simone said, "And now they do." Marlene said, "Now they do." Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Great-Uncle Darnell knew." Marlene said, "Maybe." Simone said, "I think he knew, and I think that's why he kept it." Marlene thought about the brown suit and the handshake at the funeral and the 40 years of tax payments on a piece of wet ground that cost almost nothing to hold and revealed nothing about what it was unless you looked at it in exactly the right way. She said, "Maybe you're right." She thought maybe Simone was right. The final negotiation session was not dramatic in the way the word negotiation suggested. It was 2 phone calls over 2 days, preceded by a document exchange that lasted a week, all of which Whitmore described to her in precise, measured language that kept the process from feeling either too close or too far away. The dot's final position, when it arrived, was $780,000. Whitmore presented it to her by phone on a Wednesday morning. He said, "This is their ceiling. I believe this is their ceiling based on the language of the proposal and the project timeline pressures they're operating under. I want you to know that I believe we could push for a hearing and potentially achieve a higher number. But I also want you to know that hearings carry risk and time, and that 780 is within the range Dr. Okafor's report supports, and that it represents a real and significant outcome." He said, "It is your decision." She sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and the number $780,000 written on the page in her careful handwriting. She thought about the gap between 780 and 1.2 million. She thought about hearings and risk and time. She thought about the shifts at the clinic and the coat lining and the shutoff notice and the lentils. She thought about Simone saying it bothered me more when our business was the other kind. She thought about Darnell. She said, "What do you think?" Whitmore said, "I think 780 is a just outcome for this property and for you. I think a hearing could get you more, but it could also get you a 2-year process that costs you the certainty of what's on the table now. If I were advising a member of my family, I would say, take the 780. She said, "That's what I needed to know." She said, "Let's settle." He said, "I'll prepare the acceptance." She said, "Thank you," and hung up the phone. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. $780,000. She said it quietly to the empty room, not because she needed to hear it, but because saying it out loud made it different from a number on a page. It made it a statement about what had happened, what she had found and understood and pursued and not let go of. It made it a description of the distance between the shutoff notice and now, a distance she had crossed not by luck, though luck had been present, but by reading and calling and driving 3 hours to look at a swamp and standing on a small rise of ground and asking, "What is this?" and being willing to sit with the answer long enough to understand it. $780,000 for 41 acres of bog land that the county had valued at $4,200, that Marcus had called a swamp, that the DOT's first appraiser had written off as undeveloped natural land worth nothing particular. The bog had been worth this all along. The land had not changed. The water had not changed. The plants had not changed. What had changed was who was looking at it, and with what knowledge, and with what willingness to say, "This is not what you think it is." She opened the notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the number, $780,000. Below it she wrote, "Settlement accepted." Below that, after a moment, she wrote, "Darnell." She closed the notebook and sat with it in her lap, and the kitchen was quiet, and the clock ticked, and she let the fact of what had happened settle into her, the way water settled into ground. She picked up her phone and called Yvette. She said, "We settled." Yvette said, "How much?" She told her. Yvette made the sound again, the one that wasn't quite a word. And then she said Marlene's name 3 times in a row. And then she started crying, which she would later describe to everyone as happy crying, as if the distinction required clarification. And Marlene sat at the kitchen table and let her sister cry into the phone, and felt something moving through her own chest that was full enough that she pressed her hand flat against the table just to feel something solid. The settlement process itself took 6 more weeks. There was paperwork, which Whitmore guided her through with patience. There was a review period. There was a title verification. There was a moment, around week 4, when a clerical issue in the county records created a 3-day delay that Marlene handled by going to her shift and not checking her email more than twice a day, which required a level of self-discipline she had not previously needed to apply to herself. And then, on a Thursday morning in early summer, the wire transfer completed. Whitmore called her to confirm it. He said the funds were in the account his office had established for the disbursement, and that once the firm's contingency fee was deducted, the net transfer to her personal account would be approximately $671,000, reflecting the settlement amount minus the agreed percentage. He said, "Congratulations, Marlene," she said. "Thank you. Thank you for believing in the report." He said, "I believed in the land. Dr. Okafor believed in the land. You believed in the land first. That's the part that mattered." She thanked him again and hung up. She looked at her phone for a moment. Then she opened her banking app, which she had avoided opening for months because opening it had always produced a number that required her to make choices she did not want to make. She opened it now. The number in her account was not a number she had ever seen associated with herself before. It had too many digits. It looked for a moment like it belonged to someone else's life, misdelivered, the way sometimes a piece of mail arrived with your address, but a stranger's name. She looked at it until it became real, until it sat in her mind with the ordinary weight of a fact rather than the impossible brightness of a fantasy. It took longer than she expected. Then she drove to Simone's school. She arrived at 11:30, which was during Simone's second period. She went to the office and said she needed to sign her daughter out for a family appointment. The secretary, who had seen Marlene before at events and pickup lines, asked if everything was okay. Marlene said yes, everything was fine, thank you. She signed the form. Simone appeared in the office doorway looking concerned in the specific way teenagers looked when pulled from class unexpectedly. She saw her mother's face, and the concern changed into something else, something questioning. Marlene said, "Nothing's wrong. I just wanted to tell you something in person." They sat in the car in the school parking lot, Marlene told her. She told her the number, the full number, not approximate, not hedged. She told her what had been deducted and what remained. She told her it was real, that it was in an account, that it existed. Simone sat very still. She looked at the dashboard. She looked at her hands in her lap. She said, "Is this because of the bog?" Aunt Marlene said, "Yes." Simone said, "Great-Uncle Darnell's bog." Marlene said, "Our bog. The 19 acres that aren't under acquisition are still ours." Simone looked at her. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes got when the pressure behind them was significant and being held. She said, "What are we going to do?" Marlene said, "A lot of things. First, I'm going to pay off everything we owe. Every dollar. Then I'm going to put a significant amount away for your education. And I mean all of it. Wherever you want to go, no limits on that. And I'm going to think carefully about the rest, because I've been thinking carefully about money for a long time, and I'm not going to stop now, just because there's more of it." Simone was quiet. She said, "Are we going to move? Marlene said. I think so. I think we're going to find a place that's ours. Simone nodded. She pressed her lips together. She looked out the window at the school building and the other cars in the lot and the ordinary Thursday morning that wasn't ordinary at all. She said, I want to go back to see the bog. Marlene said, We will. She said, I want to see it before they build the highway. Marlene said, We will. We'll go soon. Simone turned back and looked at her mother. She had her father's calm and her mother's eyes, and she was 14 years old, and she had made beans and rice without asking questions, and sat at a kitchen table with one lamp on to save electricity, and said nothing that would add to a weight she could see was already heavy. She said, I knew it was going to be okay. Marlene said, Did you? Simone said, Not always, but mostly. She reached over and squeezed her mother's hand once, briefly, and then let go and said, Can we get lunch before you take me back? Marlene said, Yes. They went and got lunch, a real lunch, at a place with menus and a waiter and food that was not calculated against anything. They ordered what they wanted and ate it and talked about ordinary things, about Simone's friends and her biology project, and a book she was reading, and a film she wanted to see, about small things and immediate things, and things that had nothing to do with land or money, or the long months of managing the gap between what was and what was needed. Marlene paid the bill without looking at the total first, which was something she had not done in 8 months, and the ordinary ease of it was so startling that she had to look out the window for a moment and breathe. They drove back to the school, and Simone got out and then leaned back through the open window. She said, Mom. Marlene said, Yeah. Simone said, He chose you, you know. Great-Uncle Darnell. He could have given it to anyone, and he chose you. Marlene said, I know. She did not say anything else. Simone went back into the school. Marlene sat in the parking lot for a while before she drove away. The things that happened in the weeks following the settlement were not dramatic individually. Taken together, they represented a different kind of story than the one that had been running for 8 months. That story had been about narrowing, about the gradual contraction of options, about days that produced problems and weeks that accumulated them into a pressure that required constant management. The new story was about the opposite motion, about options opening rather than closing, about decisions that were choices rather than necessities. She paid the back rent in full. She called the property management office and spoke to a woman named Diana who handled accounts, and she paid 4 months of arrears plus the current month with a single transaction. And Diana said, Thank you, in a voice that suggested she had not expected this call to go this way, and Marlene thanked her and hung up. She paid Georgette the $40 she had borrowed in February. She went to Georgette's door on a Saturday morning and handed her the cash and said, I'm sorry this took so long. Georgette said it really wasn't necessary, and Marlene said, I know, but it was to me. Georgette held the bills and looked at her with the direct warmth of someone who had always liked her, and who now understood something had changed and was glad about it without needing to perform gladness. She called the electric company and paid the account current and took herself off the automatic hardship payment plan she had been on for 5 months. She called the cell phone company and paid her bill and upgraded her plan because she had been on a minimal plan for cost reasons, and it had been inconvenient in ways she had simply absorbed as part of managing. She did these things methodically, in order, going down the list she had kept in the notebook. Each item she crossed off felt not like celebration but like restoration, like returning something to the condition it was supposed to be in. So like cleaning a room that had been allowed to get too cluttered, not from negligence, but from a shortage of time and capacity, and now having both again. When the practical obligations were addressed, she turned to the larger decisions. She had been saving, carefully, a portion of the settlement in a separate account while she worked through what she wanted to do. Whitmore had referred her to a financial advisor, a woman named Teresa, who specialized in working with people who had received sudden significant assets and needed help thinking through them. Teresa was direct and unhurried and did not try to rush Marlene into any particular position. She asked questions and listened to the answers, and then asked more questions. She asked, "What is the most important thing to you?" Marlene said, "Simone's future. No limits on what she can pursue." Teresa said, "That's the first allocation. We set that aside fully, and it doesn't move regardless of what else we decide." She said, "What else?" Marlene said, "Stability. A home that's ours. Not rented, not borrowed against. Something we own." Teresa said, "That's the second allocation." She said, "And beyond that?" Marlene thought about it. She said, "I want to keep working. I like my work. I'm good at it, and it matters, and I don't want to stop. But I want to do it because I choose to, not because I have to." Teresa nodded and wrote something in her own notebook. She said, "That's not a small thing, knowing the difference between those two." Marlene said, "I've had a lot of time to think about it." They met 3 more times over the following weeks and made a plan that reflected those priorities, specific and concrete, with allocations for each category and a long-term structure that did not depend on any single decision going perfectly. Marlene understood, from the months of reading she had done about the DOT process and the appraisal and the negotiation, that understanding a situation required time and precision and the willingness to ask questions until the answers made sense. She brought that same approach to the financial decisions. She was not careless with the money because she was not careless with anything. She found a house in a neighborhood 3 miles from where she currently lived, close enough to keep Simone in her school through the end of the year. And it was a 2-story house on a corner lot with a small yard that had been let go and needed work, and which Marlene looked at with the specific eye of someone who had spent months learning to see value beneath neglect. She made an offer. The offer was accepted. The day she signed the closing documents, she called Yvette from the parking lot of the title company. Yvette said, "How does it feel?" Marlene said, "Like something that was supposed to happen and took a long time to get to." Yvette said, "That's exactly what it is." Marlene said, "Yes." They talked for a while about nothing in particular, the way sisters talked when the important thing had already been said, and what remained was simply the pleasure of talking. About Yvette's kids and their summer plans, and a restaurant they both wanted to try, and whether Marlene was going to get a new car, which she was, practically, because the current one had a sound that had evolved from concerning to genuinely alarming. Before they hung up, Yvette said, "Marcus wants to say something to you." Marlene said, "He doesn't have to." Yvette said, "He wants to." "Hold on." There was the sound of the phone being handed across a room, and then Marcus's voice came on, and it had none of the confidence of the 2 calls he had made to her during those long months. It was quieter than she had ever heard it. He said, "Marlene, I was wrong about what I said. Both times. I should have been more supportive, and I wasn't, and I'm sorry." She said, "I appreciate that." He said, "You did something I didn't think was possible." She said, "I didn't do something impossible. I just looked at something everyone else assumed wasn't worth looking at." He said, "Still." She said, "Marcus, it's okay. I understand why you thought what you thought. I'll see you at the next family thing." He said, "Yeah." "Okay." He handed the phone back to Yvette, and Marlene could hear, faintly in the background, the sound of Yvette saying something to him in a voice that was too low to make out, but that had a distinct quality of marital commentary. And despite everything, Marlene laughed. She drove home through streets that were beginning to feel like a chapter that was ending rather than continuing. And she thought about Darnell, who she thought about often now, not with the vague disconnection of someone she had known briefly, but with the specific attention of someone she was trying to understand. She had done some research on him in the weeks after the settlement, not extensive research, and she was not trying to reconstruct his life. But she had found a few things. He had worked for the county roads department for 31 years, which was interesting. He had purchased the bog parcel in 1987 for $3,000 from an estate sale, which had seemed unremarkable at the time, given that bog land in that corridor was essentially unwanted. He had paid the property taxes on it every year, without fail, until he died, which meant he had been thinking about it annually, had been making a decision to keep it annually for 36 years. She had found, through the probate records, a handwritten note that had been included with the will and that the probate attorney had not thought to mention because it did not have legal weight. It said, in Darnell's handwriting, on which she recognized from a birthday card he had sent once, "For Marlene, because she's the kind of person who doesn't let go of something just because other people say it's not worth holding." She had read that sentence many times. She did not know when he had written it or what had prompted it. She did not know if he had known about the highway or had simply held the land on instinct and a private logic she would never fully access. She did not know why he had chosen her, and not Yvette or Reggie or any of the others. What she knew was that he had been right about her, not in a way that required him to have been prescient or strategic, just right, in the simple, accurate way of someone who had watched a person long enough to know what they were made of. And she was the kind of person who didn't let go of something just because other people said it wasn't worth holding. She had demonstrated that. She had demonstrated it by making 11 phone calls before she got a person who knew what a DOT portal record was. By driving 3 hours to stand on wet ground in the middle of nowhere and ask what this was. By reading 43 pages of ecological assessment and then reading it again. By sitting across from a lawyer and signing a document that said she was asking the state for $1.2 million for a bog and keeping her voice steady while she did it. She had not known she could do any of that before she did it. Or perhaps she had known it in the background of herself, the way people sometimes knew things about themselves that circumstances had not yet required them to demonstrate. And she and Simone went back to the bog on a Saturday in late June, 3 weeks before the construction crews were scheduled to begin the survey work on the right-of-way corridor. They drove the 3 hours the same way they had driven the first time, Simone sleeping against the window for the first hour, Marlene watching the landscape shift from urban to rural to the particular quiet of Richfield County's back roads. The gate opened with the same protesting hinge. The path was the same. The air was the same, cool and heavy with the smell of water and deep green growth. The cattails had reached their full summer height. The water between them caught the late morning light in flickering patches. The birds were louder than they had been in autumn. They walked the path without talking much. There was not much that needed to be said here. The bog did not require commentary. It was what it was, complete in itself, indifferent to the story it had been part of. They reached the small rise and stood on it together, looking out over the water and the vegetation and the tree line at the distance. Simone said, "I can see why he kept it." Marlene said, "Can you?" Simone said, "It's the kind of place where nothing needs to be explained." Marlene looked at her daughter and then looked back at the bog. She thought, "Yes," she thought. "That's exactly it." They stood there for a while. A red-winged blackbird landed on a cattail nearby, the same species, if not the same bird that had looked at Marlene so directly the first time she was here. It regarded them without alarm, and then turned to look at something in the water that Marlene could not see. She thought about the months behind her. The shutoff notice, and the coat lining, and the $40, and the rice, and the lentils, and the one lamp, and Simone at the kitchen table with her pencil moving in slow, deliberate strokes. She thought about the probate letter in its beige envelope and the number 4,200 and how she had laughed, that short, humorless sound that startled a sparrow. She thought about Darnell in his brown suit, the handshake at the funeral, the sentence in the note, the 36 years of property tax payments, the quiet holding of something no one else wanted. She thought about Dr. Okafor crouching on the small rise and standing and looking in different directions and saying, "This is not common ground." She thought, "No, it is not." She had 19 acres left. The highway would take the western 22, and what remained would be hers without encumbrance, a piece of living ground in a county 3 hours southeast, visited by blackbirds and painted turtles, and the slow movement of water through an intact hydrology that had not been interrupted in all the years it had been held by a man in a brown suit who had understood, somehow, that some things were worth more than anyone would tell you if you were the kind of person who could see past what things appeared to be. She intended to keep those 19 acres, not for their monetary value, though she understood now what they were worth, not as an investment, though they were one. She intended to keep them because the bog had been the thing that changed everything, not by being a treasure in the way treasures were usually imagined, or hidden and dramatic and waiting to be discovered by the right person at the right moment. It had changed everything by being exactly what it was, a piece of the world functioning as it had always functioned, valuable in ways that required knowledge to perceive and patience to pursue, and the refusal to accept that the assessed price of something was the same as its worth. That refusal had cost her nothing except the willingness to look carefully. She had looked carefully, and she had found what was there. She looked out over the bog for another few minutes, the water and the reeds, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of the place, and then she said to Simone, "Ready?" Simone said, "Almost." They stood there a little longer. Then they walked back down the path to the car, but through the heavy summer air and the sounds of the birds and the soft give of the ground beneath their feet, and Marlene locked the gate behind them. On the drive home, the landscape moved past them in long, slow intervals, the county roads giving way to the broader state highway, the agricultural flatlands opening on either side, the sky large and cloudless above all of it. Simone was awake this time, looking out the window with the quiet attention she gave to things she was trying to memorize. Marlene watched the road and thought about what came next, which was a different kind of thinking than she had done in a long time. For 8 months, what came next had been defined by what could not be avoided. Bills, notices, the arithmetic of subtraction. What came next now was something she had to choose, and the choosing required a different kind of muscle, one she was only beginning to feel the edges of again. She had been turning over an idea for several weeks, quietly, the way she turned things over when she was not sure if they were ready to be spoken about yet. She had not mentioned it to Yvette, or to Teresa, or even to Simone. It had come to her gradually, assembled from separate pieces, the way things sometimes assembled themselves when you had spent enough time sitting with a problem. The idea had started with Dr. Okafor's report, specifically with the section she had read most carefully, the one that described the ecological significance of the parcel in the context of what had been lost in the surrounding region. The report had documented, with precision and without sentimentality, that the bog was one of fewer than a dozen intact interior bog systems of comparable size remaining in the county. It had documented the reasons for that rarity, which were mostly the same reason anything disappeared from a landscape. People had needed land for other things, had drained it, cleared it, developed it, valued it only in the terms of what could be built on top of it, rather than what lived within it. The bog had survived because no one had needed it urgently enough to justify the cost of altering it, and because a man in a brown suit had paid $11 a year in property taxes and never sold. The report had said, in its final section, that conservation of the remaining 19 acres beyond the right-of-way corridor would represent a meaningful contribution to the regional ecological baseline. It had noted, in careful professional language, that conservation easements and similar protections were available mechanisms for private landowners who wished to ensure the long-term integrity of such parcels. Marlene had read that section 3 times. Then she had put it aside and not thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she had started thinking about it again, and once she had started, she had not been able to stop. A conservation easement, as she understood it from the reading she had since done, was a legal agreement between a landowner and a conservation organization or government entity, in which the landowner voluntarily restricted certain uses of their land in exchange for protections that ensured those restrictions would be honored permanently, including after the land changed hands. In some cases, some conservation easements also carried tax benefits. In some cases, conservation organizations paid for them, treating the restriction of development rights as a purchase, because the right to develop was itself a form of value, and surrendering it permanently was worth something to the organizations whose purpose was to ensure certain landscapes persisted. She had called a regional land trust, whose name had appeared in the county environmental records she had spent so many weeks reading. The woman she had spoken to had been unhurried and specific in the way people were when they spent their lives on a subject they cared about, and were accustomed to explaining it to people who had never encountered it before. She had asked about the parcel. When Marlene described it, including the classification and the hydrology findings from Dr. Okafor's report, the woman had gone quiet in a way that was attentive rather than distracted. She had said, "That's a Category 2 interior bog?" Marlene had said, "That's what the assessment found." The woman had said, "Those are not common in this county anymore." Marlene had said, "I know." They had talked for 40 minutes. The woman had explained what a conservation easement would mean for the 19 acres, what it would protect, and what it would allow. She had said that the land trust would be interested in discussing the possibility further, and that she would like to arrange a site visit with their own ecologist to verify the classification before any formal conversation about terms. Marlene had said yes. She had not told anyone about that call yet. She was not keeping it secret exactly. She was keeping it the way she kept things that were still becoming, holding them close until they were solid enough to share without losing their shape. She thought about it now, driving through the flat summer landscape with Simone watching out the window. She thought about what it would mean to put a permanent protection on those 19 acres, to ensure that whatever happened after her, whoever owned it, or held it, or inherited it, the bog would remain a bog. The water would remain. The plants would remain. The painted turtles and the red-winged blackbirds would remain. The intact hydrology that Dr. Okafor had found so remarkable would continue to function as it had functioned for however many hundreds of years it had been functioning, without interruption, without drainage, and without the assumption that its value lay in what could replace it. She thought about Darnell and what he would make of that. She thought he might have made a great deal of it. A man who had worked for the county roads department, who had spent 31 years in the work of building and maintaining the infrastructure that connected places to one another, had also spent 36 years protecting 19 acres from becoming something else. Maybe that was its own kind of road work, the maintenance of a connection to something that had no capacity to protect itself. She thought, "I'm going to do this." Not as a question, not as a possibility still being weighed, as a fact arriving, which was different. Simone said without turning from the window, "What are you thinking about?" Marlene said, "The 19 acres." Simone turned and looked at her. Marlene said, I've been talking to a land trust about putting a conservation easement on it. Simone was quiet, considering. She said, "What does that mean exactly?" Marlene explained it the way she had come to understand it, plainly and specifically. Simone listened with the focused attention she gave to things she wanted to understand, fully before responding. When Marlene finished, Simone said, "So no one can ever develop it?" Marlene said, "Not with the easement in place. It stays as it is, permanently." Simone said, "Even after us?" Marlene said, "That's the point of it." "Yes." Simone turned back to the window. The road moved under them. A grain elevator passed on the right, tall and pale against the sky. After a moment, Simone said, "I think we should do it." Marlene said, "Yeah?" What Simone said, "The highway is going to take part of it. Something should keep the rest." Marlene said, "That's what I thought." They drove the rest of the way home, mostly in silence, but it was the kind of silence that was full rather than empty, occupied by the particular satisfaction of two people who have arrived at the same place by different routes and recognize each other there. The new house was not fully settled yet when Marlene moved the last of their things in. There were boxes in the second bedroom and a stack of picture frames leaning against the wall in the hallway, and a kitchen that was larger than anything they had lived in for years, which meant that for the first several days, Marlene found herself standing in it, slightly longer than necessary, orienting herself to the extra space. The yard was overgrown in the way she had expected, but when she walked through it on the first evening she had owned the property, she noticed that beneath the neglected grass there was evidence of what had once been a garden. The ghost of raised beds, a brick border half buried in soil, the dry stalk of something that had once been tall and intentional. She thought, "I can do something with this." She thought it the way she had been thinking about things lately, not as a maybe, not as a someday, but as a plain assessment of what was in front of her and what she was capable of. Simone chose her room on the first day and arranged it with a decisiveness that suggested she had been thinking about what she wanted for some time. She put her desk by the window. She organized her books by a system Marlene did not fully understand, but did not question. She spent an hour in the yard on the second day with her phone, photographing things at ground level, the texture of the soil, a beetle moving across a patch of bare earth, the brick border Marlene had found. She did not explain what the photographs were for, and Marlene did not ask. Patricia, her friend from the old hospital job, came over on a Saturday afternoon with a plant for the kitchen and an hour's worth of conversation that moved easily and without effort across the distance that 8 months and different circumstances had put between them. They sat in the new kitchen with coffee and the afternoon light coming through the window and talked the way old friends talked when something had changed and they were finding the new register together. Patricia said at some point, "You seem different." Marlene said, "I am different." Patricia said, "Not just because of the money." Marlene thought about it. She said, "No, not just because of the money. Though the money is real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But I think what changed is that I found out I could understand something I didn't know how to understand, and then use that understanding to do something I didn't know I could do. And once you know that about yourself, you can't unknow it." Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said, "You always could do that." Marlene said, "I know, but I didn't know it the way I know it now." There was a difference, she had come to understand, between being capable of something and having demonstrated that capability under conditions that had cost you something. The months of managing on almost nothing, the reading and the calls and the slow, patient assembly of information into understanding. The moment in Whitmore's office when she had signed the document asking for a number that had felt both impossible and exact, all of it had been a demonstration. Not to anyone else. To herself. She did not say all of that to Patricia. She said enough of it, and Patricia understood the rest. Reggie came by the following weekend with his wife and 2 children, and a contribution to the housewarming that was warm and generous, and which Marlene accepted without the complicated accounting she would have applied to it 8 months earlier. He stood in the kitchen and looked around with an expression that was unguarded in a way Reggie's expressions rarely were. He said, "I'm glad you called me. Back at the beginning, when you told me about the land." Marlene said, "You told me to sell it," he said. "I know. I'm glad you didn't listen." She said, "You also lent me $300, he said. "I did do that," she said. "That mattered. I want you to know that mattered." He shrugged in the way he shrugged when something had landed, but he was not going to say so directly. And she did not press it, because she knew him well enough to understand when something had been received, even without the receipt being acknowledged. The family gathered properly for the first time since the settlement on a Sunday in late July, a loose, sprawling occasion at Yvette's house that had the texture of a celebration without being formally called one. There was food and children running between rooms and the ordinary overlapping conversations of a family that had been tracking the same story from different positions and was now arriving together at its conclusion. Marcus grilled, which was his usual role at these things, and he did it with the focused competence of someone who was grateful for a task that did not require him to navigate the conversation in the room. Marlene did not seek him out or avoid him. When they found themselves near each other at the edge of the gathering, he handed her a plate and said she looked well. She said thank you and meant it without complication. She had thought in the weeks after his apology about what she actually felt toward him. Not about the apology, which she had accepted and was done with. About the months before it, the 2 calls, the certainty he had brought to his doubt. She had arrived at something that was not quite forgiveness, because forgiveness implied an injury that required healing, and what she felt was closer to understanding. He had looked at her circumstances, and her asset, and her plan, and had seen exactly what most people would have seen: a struggling woman holding what looked like nothing, being told by a lawyer that the nothing might be worth something, and had responded to that picture with the same assumption the DOT's first appraiser had brought to the county records. The assumption of ordinary appearances. He had been wrong in the same way most people were wrong about most things, not from malice, but from a failure to look carefully enough and long enough at what was actually there. She had corrected that failure, not by arguing or proving or insisting, but by being right. That was the only correction that held. She stood in Yvette's backyard in the late afternoon sun and watched the children play and ate the food Marcus had grilled and felt the particular fullness of a day that did not require anything of her except presence. Her cousin Derek, who had called from another state with that carefully hedged promising, was there as well, having arranged a trip specifically for this gathering, which told her something about what the story had meant to people even far from its center. He hugged her when he arrived and said he had always known she was going to land on her feet, which she let pass without correction because she understood it was the thing people said when they were genuinely glad for you and did not know a better way to say it. But Simone moved through the gathering with the ease of someone who had found her footing in the new story without losing track of the old one. She was 14 and had spent 8 months watching her mother manage the edge of things, and now she watched her mother stand comfortably in the middle of a summer afternoon, and the watching had a different quality to it, something released. Near the end of the evening, when the gathering had thinned and the children were tired and the conversations had slowed to their quieter late evening register, Yvette found Marlene at the edge of the yard. She did not say anything for a moment. They stood together in the cooling air and listened to the sounds of the family behind them, the voices and laughter, and the ordinary comfortable noise of people who belonged to each other. Yvette said, "Do you remember what Mama used to say? About things that look like nothing?" Marlene said, "She said a lot of things about things that look like nothing." Yvette said, "She said the overlooked thing is usually the most important thing." She said it all the time, about people, about situations, about everything. Marlene said, "I remember." Yvette said, "I think she would have liked this story." Marlene thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs for 20 years, and bought her house, and put both her children through school, and had been described by certain relatives for her entire life as the one who never caught a break, even when she was clearly catching breaks, even when the breaks were real and present and visible to anyone who looked. She said, "I think she would have said she told us so." Yvette laughed, and she said, "She absolutely would have said that." They stood there for another minute in the cooling yard, with the sound of the family behind them, and the sky above going from blue to the particular deep purple of a summer evening. And Marlene thought about 41 acres of bog land, and a man in a brown suit, and a probate letter in a beige envelope, and the shutoff notice in red, and the $112 in the coat lining, and all of it, the whole long chain of it, leading to this yard on this evening with her sister beside her and her daughter, somewhere in the house, and a home that was theirs 3 miles away. She thought, "It is enough." She thought, "It is more than enough." She thought, it was always going to be enough. It just needed someone to look at it long enough and carefully enough to understand what it actually was. So the bog would be there in the morning. The 19 acres would still be standing water and cattails and intact hydrology and 2 plant species that appeared in no other location within 40 miles. The land trust's ecologist was scheduled for a site visit in 3 weeks. The conservation easement was still becoming. And somewhere 3 hours southeast, in the quiet, that had nothing to do with anything that had happened or would happen to the people who had held it and let it go and held it again, the bog would be doing what it had always done, which was simply existing in the full and unhurried way of things that had never needed anyone's permission to be worth something. She looked out over the yard and breathed the summer air and let the evening be what it was. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.